Morgan sat motionless in her parked car, gripping a framed wedding photo as her husband Daniel's voice echoed in her memory. "You're being hysterical again." That word had become his favorite weapon, slicing through every disagreement, silencing her fears, erasing her truth. She blinked back tears, staring at the house they once called home. Just hours earlier, she had opened the glove compartment in his car, looking for insurance papers. Instead, she found a second phone, hidden and fully charged. One swipe, and her world shattered. Dozens of photos of Daniel with another woman. A teenage boy, voice memos, his voice talking about a life Morgan never knew existed. 3 years later, Morgan stood before Congress, delivering testimony on coercive control and the invisible scars of emotional abuse. This is the story of how a woman dismissed as too emotional uncovered a betrayal bigger than infidelity and turned her pain into lasting change. Morgan Simmons was 35 years old, a devoted middle school counselor living in a quiet suburb of Atlanta. She'd built her life around helping others, always the first to volunteer for the school fundraiser, the friend who never forgot a birthday, the wife who bent to keep peace at home. Her husband Daniel, a 38-year-old urban planner, was admired for his charisma and civic engagement. Neighbors praised his charm at barbecues, and his photos from community events flooded their social media. Morgan at his side, always smiling, always polished. From the outside, theirs was the kind of marriage people envied: matching t-shirts on vacation, cheerful holiday cards, shoe funds posted with sunny captions. But behind closed doors, Morgan's reality was far from picture perfect. Disagreements never ended with understanding. They ended with Daniel dismissing her as irrational or too emotional. If she cried, he called her manipulative. If she raised a concern, he labeled it paranoia. And when their attempts to conceive a child failed, Morgan turned inward, blaming her own body. The doctors hadn't found anything conclusive, but the grief weighed on her. Daniel rarely offered comfort. Instead, he turned her pain into ammunition during fights. "Maybe if you weren't so high-strung," he once said, coldly, "your body would cooperate." Daniel also maintained subtle control over their finances. While Morgan technically had access to their accounts, every purchase she made was later scrutinized. "Did you really need another therapy book?" he'd say, scrolling through the statements. "No wonder we can't afford IVF again." Over time, Morgan began to feel like a shadow in her own home. Every instinct she had was questioned. Every emotion was invalidated. So she did what she told her students to do when things felt too heavy. She sought therapy, quietly, carefully, and alone. She told no one, not even her closest friend Simone. She paid in cash, she scheduled early morning sessions, and left no digital trail. He'd once laughed during a dinner party, mocking a friend for needing to pay someone to cry. The therapist was the first person to say the words Morgan couldn't form herself: emotional abuse, coercive control, gaslighting. Words that made her stomach turn, but also brought clarity. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't broken. She was being conditioned to doubt her reality by someone who claimed to love her. And still, Morgan hesitated. She wanted to believe there was something worth salvaging, that if she just worked harder, stayed calmer, made fewer mistakes, things would go back to how they were in the beginning. But even those early days, when Daniel was attentive and affectionate, now felt like a performance, a script he followed to pull her in. As the months passed, Morgan became more observant. She noticed the way Daniel always had his phone on silent, how he took longer business trips, how his charm turned up in public only to vanish at home. She wrote things down in a journal she hid in the back of her closet, not to accuse, just to remind herself of what was real. Because every day it got harder to tell. Morgan began noticing the small shifts, first subtle but frequent. Daniel, who once made a show of being home for dinner, started spending more evenings working late. At first, she believed him. Unpredictable schedules, last-minute meetings, community events, but the pattern soon became too regular to ignore. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he'd be gone until midnight. When Morgan asked for details, he waved her off. "You wouldn't understand the politics," he'd say with a tired sigh. "It's all boring zoning debates anyway." She didn't press. Not then. But the crack widened the weekend he canceled their couple's retreat. It had taken weeks to schedule around both of their jobs, and Morgan had been looking forward to it. A rare chance to reconnect. Daniel called the night before, claiming an urgent city planning emergency. "I'll make it up to you," he promised. "We'll do something special next weekend." But that weekend, while scrolling through social media, Morgan paused. A friend had posted a birthday photo from Asheville. There, unmistakable in the background, was Daniel, laughing, relaxed, holding a drink in a cozy-looking bar. Morgan stared at the screen, numb. Maybe it was an old photo? Maybe he had a good reason? Maybe... The doubt was constant, confusing, exhausting. A few days later, she found a receipt tucked between papers on his desk. A jewelry store receipt, dated 2 weeks earlier. For a silver necklace, with sapphire detailing. She hadn't received any gift. No birthday, no anniversary, no mention. Still, she questioned herself. Had she forgotten? Had she misplaced it? Morgan's mind became a war zone. She started wondering if she was truly losing it. Daniel certainly treated her that way. "You're always jumping to conclusions," he told her when she asked about the canceled trip. "You're always looking for something to be upset about." To calm her rising panic, she decided to do something practical. Under the guise of safety, she suggested they both download a location tracking app. "In case something happens," she said lightly. Daniel agreed with a smile, but she could tell he didn't think she'd actually use it. And for a while she didn't. Until she had trouble sleeping one night and opened the app on a whim. Daniel was across town, in a quiet suburban neighborhood she didn't recognize. At midnight, on a Tuesday. He stayed there for 2 hours. She checked again on Thursday. Same address, same pattern. Morgan wrote the address down, but didn't confront him. She couldn't. Not yet. There was still a small voice in her head, telling her not to overreact, not to be paranoid, not to be that kind of wife. The one who snoops, accuses, explodes. But another part of her, the part that had grown stronger since starting therapy, knew something was deeply wrong. The truth wasn't in her imagination. It was in the silence, in the inconsistencies, in the sick feeling that wouldn't go away. She just wasn't ready to face what it meant. Not yet. Morgan's car refused to start on a rainy Tuesday morning. She was already running late for a school presentation, and with no time to wait for a mechanic, she grabbed Daniel's keys from the kitchen counter. He wouldn't be home until late, and she planned to be back before he even noticed. The drive was uneventful, until she reached into the glove compartment, looking for a napkin. Her fingers brushed against a bundle, a slim black phone charger, a velvet ring box, and something heavier, a second phone. It was tucked behind the manual, clearly hidden. Her heart began pounding. She hesitated for a long moment. Then, curiosity and dread took over. She pressed the power button. It lit up. No passcode request, just a prompt for a fingerprint or numerical code. On instinct, she entered his birthday. It unlocked instantly. Her hands trembled as she scrolled. There were hundreds of photos. Daniel with a woman Morgan didn't recognize, smiling in cafes, holding hands at the park, even family dinners. And there was a teenage boy in many of them, his arms slung around Daniel like they were family. The most recent photo had been taken 3 days ago. Next, she opened the voice memo app. The first clip started with Daniel's voice, calm and low. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Morgan's still suspicious, but she's fragile. She's always been fragile." The next one chilled her to the core. "I didn't mean to end up with 2 lives, But Morgan was the mistake I can't undo. Her breath caught in her throat. She closed the phone, shoved everything back into the compartment, and sped home. Once there, she barely made it to the bathroom before she was sick. The betrayal was overwhelming, but more than that, it was the deliberate erasure of her, the gaslighting, the calculated lies, all the moments he made her feel small, paranoid, broken, while he was living another life just miles away. She washed her face and stared at herself in the mirror, trying to recognize the woman looking back. This wasn't a bad day, or a bad fight. This was a whole other reality. That evening, she sat at the dinner table as Daniel casually served pasta, humming to himself like nothing was wrong. He finally looked up and said, "I know you're upset. You always get like this when you feel ignored." It wasn't an apology. It was a dismissal. Another tiny weapon. Morgan didn't respond. She didn't scream, accuse, or break down. Instead, she chewed slowly, swallowed, and nodded. Because something in her had finally snapped into focus. She would not confront him tonight. Not yet. She would gather herself, collect proof, and build the truth with quiet, unshakable precision. For now, silence was her sharpest weapon. Morgan didn't sleep that night. She lay still beside Daniel, listening to his steady breath, every second sharpening her focus. At sunrise, she quietly got out of bed, dressed, and began her plan. The first thing she did was back up every file from the second phone. She transferred the voice memos, photos, texts, and call logs to a secure drive, then uploaded them to cloud storage with a private password. She took screenshots of everything, each photo with timestamps, each memo transcribed word for word. She copied his contact lists, location history, and even browsing data. Next, she made 2 phone calls, one to a private investigator her therapist had once mentioned, and another to a highly recommended divorce attorney known for discretion and grit. By midweek, the PI returned with results that turned Morgan's stomach. Daniel wasn't just cheating. He was financing an entirely separate life. His name appeared on the lease of an apartment in a quiet suburb. He was listed as the emergency contact for a woman named Clarissa Hightower, and her teenage son, Jordan. Digging deeper, the investigator uncovered tuition payments for Jordan at a private school, health insurance coverage, and multiple Venmo transfers labeled groceries and field trip. Even more disturbing, Daniel had filled out a school form as Jordan's guardian. Not just a father figure. Legally, in Clarissa's world, he was Jordan's parent. Morgan stared at the documents with shaking hands. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was public, documented, and financial. She couldn't go directly to Daniel, yet. Instead, she devised a plan to learn more. At help from her PI, Morgan scheduled a meeting with Clarissa. She posed as a school administrator, verifying contact information for an upcoming parent-teacher night. When she called and introduced herself, Clarissa sounded cheerful, even familiar. "Sure," Clarissa said. "I thought Daniel's assistant might call. He's been swamped with community events lately." Morgan's heart pounded. Assistant. That's who she was to this woman. Not a wife, not a partner. Just another functionary in Daniel's carefully constructed double life. Morgan kept her voice calm, took down the information, thanked her, and ended the call. Then she sat in silence, absorbing the magnitude of it all. That night, after Daniel left for another fundraiser, Morgan took a final step. She moved $35,000, 0 cents, from their joint savings account into a separate, legally protected escrow account her attorney had prepared. It was the amount she could prove she had directly deposited over the past year. Her money. She had the receipts. She also initiated the process to freeze any further large withdrawals unless both parties signed. She began documenting every instance of emotional abuse and gaslighting. She wrote down exact quotes. "You always do this. You make things up. Maybe if you weren't so emotional. She printed their credit card statements, highlighting expenses tied to Clarissa and Jordan. She saved text messages between them, cross-referenced with GPS data, and included screenshots of Daniel's online calendar, which was almost entirely fabricated. This wasn't a woman spiraling anymore. This was a woman building a case. Each file, each screenshot, each recorded call added another brick to her wall of truth. She didn't want to destroy Daniel out of vengeance. She wanted protection. She wanted to reclaim her voice and ensure she would never be dismissed as hysterical again. Morgan was done waiting for honesty. Now, she would let the truth speak louder than his lies ever could. Morgan knew timing was everything. She waited until the night of the community gala, an event Daniel had been hyping for weeks. He was being honored with a Leadership in Urban Renewal award, surrounded by local officials, media, and donors. He stood at the podium, grinning as they called his name. But as he reached for the microphone, a woman in a black suit approached the stage. "Daniel Simmons?" she asked clearly. "You've been served?" She handed him a thick envelope. Cameras flashed. The applause stopped. Daniel's smile froze, then melted into confusion and horror. Inside the envelope was a 60-page binder compiled by Morgan and her legal team, detailing not just the affair, but years of financial mismanagement, possible bigamy, coercive control, and emotional abuse. Bank transfers, guardian documents, voice memos, screenshots, signed lease agreements. Morgan hadn't just caught him, she'd built a legal fortress. That night, Morgan's lawyer filed for an emergency asset freeze. Her name was removed from any financial obligations connected to Clarissa or the child. Clarissa, upon learning the truth, retained her own attorney and cut all ties with Daniel. A week later, a local journalist broke the story. Beloved civic leader exposed for living double life. The article didn't mention Morgan by name, but the details were unmistakable. Sponsors and donors quickly distanced themselves. Daniel was removed from the Civic Commission, and a major redevelopment contract he had been working on was quietly canceled. But Morgan wasn't done. She published a blog post titled, "The Gaslit Wife." It started with one sentence. "They said I was hysterical. Turns out, I was just right." The blog detailed how manipulation, financial control, and emotional gaslighting had silenced her for years. It resonated like a firestorm. Thousands of women began sharing their own stories. By the end of the week, The Gaslit Wife had been shared over 250,000 times. Morgan began receiving interview requests. She declined most, but agreed to a podcast segment with a well-known feminist advocate. That appearance led to a speaking engagement. Then another. She realized her story wasn't isolated. It was systemic. So she launched her own podcast, Wives Who Woke Up. The first episode was raw, real, and honest. It charted the emotional fallout, the fear, the shame, and the moment she decided to rise. Guest submissions flooded in. Lawyers, psychologists, survivors. Each episode became a lifeline to someone. With support from advocacy groups, Morgan began working with lawmakers to propose a bill recognizing coercive control as a legal form of domestic abuse. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the women who'd been silenced, dismissed, or doubted. Daniel tried to strike back. He filed a defamation suit, claiming Morgan had ruined his life. But Morgan's attorney submitted the same 60-page binder: emails, receipts, legal filings, audio files. The judge didn't even let it proceed to trial. The case was dismissed. Daniel was now unemployed, under investigation for financial misconduct, and publicly disgraced. Morgan, on the other hand, had never stood taller. Morgan stood in the courtroom, silent but steady, as the judge finalized the settlement. She was granted full control of the marital home, their remaining savings, and both retirement accounts. Daniel didn't contest it. He couldn't. The mountain of evidence left no room for negotiation. He was permitted supervised visitation with his biological child, but Clarissa, reeling from the exposure, had already cut contact with him completely. Her attorney issued a statement, that she and her son wanted nothing more to do with Daniel Simmons. For Morgan, it was more than a legal victory. It was her liberation. She moved back into the house, now her sanctuary, and slowly reclaimed every corner. She painted over the gray walls, filled rooms with light, and took down every reminder of who Daniel pretended to be. She didn't just clean the home, she redefined it. Not long after the settlement, Morgan joined a coalition of legal and psychological experts working to draft legislation, protecting victims of coercive control and financial abuse within marriage. She attended panels, hosted webinars, and became a powerful voice in a national conversation many had long ignored. Her quiet strength caught attention. She was invited to appear on a national morning show. Sitting across from the anchor, Morgan didn't speak with rage. She spoke with clarity, with focus, with resolve. She described how emotional abuse doesn't always leave bruises, but it always leaves scars. Viewers responded instantly. Messages poured in. A week after her segment aired, Morgan received a letter from a former student. The handwriting was shaky, but the message was clear. "You once said strength wasn't loud, it was unshakable. I didn't understand it then, but now I do. Thank you for showing me." Those words settled deep in Morgan's heart. She launched an online platform called Reclaim Together, a community space for survivors of covert marital abuse. It offered resources, live support forums, legal templates, and financial guidance. It became a digital lifeline for thousands of women navigating what Morgan once faced alone. But she didn't stop there. Drawing from her background in counseling, Morgan began leading workshops focused on financial literacy for women in vulnerable domestic situations. She taught them how to read credit reports, open protected accounts, track expenses, and detect manipulation. She added one-on-one coaching sessions for women preparing to leave controlling partners. Each client was a reminder of why she had. Every now and then, Morgan would see Daniel's name surface in passing, an inquiry from someone who hadn't heard the whole story, or a whisper from someone who did. But she never engaged. She didn't need to. Morgan had outgrown the version of herself who needed his apology. She had become a voice for those who had none, a mirror to women who had forgotten their worth, and a champion for the kind of truth that couldn't be erased. Her strength wasn't about volume, it was about vision. And for the first time in years, she saw her future clearly. One built on truth, powered by purpose, and rooted in undeniable self-worth. Morgan stood in the hallway of her home, the home that once echoed with silence and subtle dread, now filled with calm and color. The final box sat near the door, full of the last traces of Daniel's life in her world. She didn't rush. She took her time lifting it, steady and sure, and placed it by the curb. She didn't need to look back. She walked room to room afterward, not with grief, but with gratitude. Every photo she'd rehung, every fresh paint stroke on the wall, every pillow on the sofa had been chosen with intention. For years, her life had been a performance. Now, it was her own quiet masterpiece. Later that evening, she opened her journal. For the longest time, those pages had held secrets, worries, and red flags she once tried to justify, but today's entry was different. She wrote about milestones she'd reached, her testimony, the women she'd helped, the peace she'd earned. The pages were no longer a map of survival, they were evidence of rebirth. That same night, she received a message on her community platform. It was from Clarissa. "I didn't know," he read. "He said you were crazy. I believed him. I'm sorry." Morgan stared at the screen for a long moment. She didn't feel anger, just a gentle sadness. And then, she replied, "I believe you." She meant it. The next day, she wrapped up a session with her therapist. As Morgan stood to leave, her therapist pulled her into a soft hug and said, "You didn't just survive this, you taught others how." Morgan smiled and nodded, blinking away the emotion. She hadn't planned to become anyone's example. But sometimes, Life demands more from you than you expect, and you become more than you thought you could be. That evening, she made herself tea and watched the sun dip below the trees from her front porch. Her dog curled at her feet, the house still and warm around her. She didn't scroll through social media. She didn't think about what Daniel might be doing or who still believed his lies. None of it mattered. She had herself. When she finally climbed into bed, the silence didn't feel hollow. It felt sacred. Her bed wasn't cold. It was hers. The stillness wasn't lonely. It was safe. She pulled the covers up, exhaled, and turned off the lamp. No ghosts, no gaslighting, no fear. Morgan closed her eyes with a peace she hadn't known in years. And somewhere deep inside her, a truth settled like a promise. Her worth wasn't up for debate. Not anymore. Not ever again. They told me I was dramatic, emotional, hysterical. They said I was making things up, that I couldn't take a joke, that I was overreacting. Every time I questioned something, I was met with smirks or silence. Every time I spoke my truth, I was made to feel like the villain. But it turns out, I wasn't crazy. I was right. He tried to erase me with manipulation, with double lives and gaslighting. He called me the mistake while building a second family behind my back. But I didn't break. I used the very truth he tried to bury to build a voice that could no longer be silenced. I turned every lie into a lesson, every betrayal into a boundary. And I wrote myself back into the world, stronger, sharper, and no longer scared. I'm Morgan Simmons, and I wasn't too emotional, I was too aware. I wasn't delusional, I was perceptive. I wasn't unstable, I was unsupported. If you've ever been told your feelings were fake, your memories flawed, or your pain imaginary, hear me now. You are not broken. You are not alone. And you are not the problem. Subscribe to Veiled Fury for more stories of gaslight turned spotlight and the women who refuse to be silenced. 'Cause our stories don't end in silence. They begin in fire and rise in truth.